Hello there, thank you for tuning in. My name is Josiah Gilliam, and I am the My Brother's Keeper Coordinator for the city of Pittsburgh and Allegheny County. I work in the office of Mayor Bill Peduto, and I'm here with a special guest, Taili Thompson. Taili Thompson serves in the Office of Violence Prevention at the Allegheny County Health Department as a coordinator for violence prevention. Taili, thank you for taking the time, man.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to have you here. So let's just get into it, man. Can you introduce yourself to the people that don't know you and are familiar with you and your work?
I'm Taili Thompson, born and raised on the north side of Pittsburgh. Got involved with this violence prevention work when violence was kind of picking up in the city of Pittsburgh in 2003. They gave they tasked Richard Garland with coming up with a solution to the violence that was taking place. Richard said, let me go to the problem for the solution. And with that, the work of One Vision, One Life was born. So I was a guy who, at the time that Richard approached me, was in the community, committing crimes at the time, basically. I mean, to put it bluntly, I was, selling drugs and different things that kind of come with that culture. And Richard came to me and was like, look, they can give me an opportunity to try to address some of the violence that's taking place in the city. I would want you to be a part of that. One of the things that he said that to me that was, there was a couple things that he said that kind of stuck out. One is that, I want to approach guys who've been a part of tearing the community down and give them an opportunity to help build it back up. And when he said that, and what kind of like was weird in a good way was that Richard seen value in my past, or kind of say my present at the time. So, a lot of times when you're in the community and you're doing bad things in the community, you're devalued by the community. You're devalued by society. And Richard was one that said, look, I see value in you and I want to find other guys similar to yourself because there's value in y'all if you want to actually be a part of transition and turning your life around and help turn the community around.
Sounds like a special person to be able to identify that in a young person. Who is Richard Garland, and to you, how would you explain who he is?
Well, to me, Richard is a mentor of mine. He gave me the opportunity to do this work. I mean, I wouldn't be sitting here today, and I tell people all the time, I wouldn't be sitting here today if it wasn't for Richard Garland. Because, he gave me a platform, he gave me an opportunity, he gave me, in a sense, it was giving me purpose to kind of commit the change that I committed in my life with the organization that he came up with at the time. So when we sat down, I actually was one of the ones who came up with the name of One Vision, One Life. So in the beginning stages, he had us sit down with some folks down at the at DHS at the time, and it was like, okay, what should we call this organization in a sense? And when the organization or the concept started, it originally was supposed to just start on the north side. And my thing was that on the north side, we're like 18 different neighborhoods, 18 different communities. We have a lot of, conflict that was going on between all those different communities. And I said, if I can get the communities and the guys that are at conflict with each other to realize that on the north side, we used to be one. Like, we were old Allegheny before we became a part of the city of Pittsburgh.
Old Allegheny City.
Old Allegheny City. So I said, man, if I can get us to realize that we were one before we was even part of the city, that would be great. And then understanding that this work is going to have to be something that you build momentum, and it's going to have to be one life at a time. And we got to realize that we're one, and it has to be something that builds momentum. So that's when I came up with the One Vision, One Life, literally. And that was where One Vision, One Life, the name came from, was that my vision, when Richard gave me an opportunity to kind of come up with a name, was my vision for what I would love the north side to be at the time that had a lot of feud and a lot of conflict that was going on, is for us to have one vision, one life, and realize that we used to be one.
So this is in the early 2000s. What did the violence look like at that time? Like, how was it described? Was it large group activity? What was it looking like?
Well, at that time there was a lot of group, kind of group violence that was coming off of that kind of group violence era.
In the 90s.
And so this was like, going on to in the 90s, there was a lot of gang violence, to be honest. I mean, that's something that we can't escape. is that at that time, throughout the different areas in the city of Pittsburgh, there was a lot of gang violence, and folks that grew up in those communities knew it, understood it, and either became a victim or a perpetrator or figured out ways to kind of navigate through those spaces. Because, they were some very tense spaces at the time. There, if you look at the history, you'll be able to see that there was some events that took place during those years that were very traumatic, very traumatizing events with the level of violence that was taking place in our different communities.
Okay, so this is 2003. You're working now with Richard Garland.
Yes.
It's 2020 now. So how has
Right.
this work kind of evolved? And then let's talk about the Office of Violence Prevention itself.
Right. So here's the beauty of the work is that at the time, we had a model, and it was a model that Aaron Dalton and Richard had kind of got from Sluckin up in Chicago.
So Aaron Dalton was working with the county at the time?
No, she first was working with actually One Vision. So before Aaron was actually at the county, because Richard was doing some stuff at Youth Work, so they had Richard come over to start this, and they had Aaron, working with him. Aaron worked at One Vision, writing grants and getting it all together as far as the documentation and all that different things.
Yeah.
So Aaron actually and Richard, kind of put the model together from the model out of Chicago. From at the time it was called Ceasefire Chicago, and it was Dr. Sluckin. So as they, was developing the model, they were actually sending us up to Chicago to learn the different implementations of this particular model.
This model is related to violence prevention intervention work?
This is directly related to violence prevention intervention work. And the beauty when you talk about the evolution, this is 2020 now, is that what we didn't realize in the language we didn't have back then, and even Sluckin didn't have it back then, is that it was a public health approach to gun violence. This was the disease model. Sluckin was called Ceasefire Chicago. We were called One Vision, One Life. We had the exact same model. Yeah. It was a public health approach, but it wasn't until recent years that the disease model and the narrative kind of caught up to the work that we used to do.
You mentioned the language
Yes.
that we have now. So how was it communicated back then? You have ceasefire, how did they explain it?
So back then, it was just like a part of activities that were being done in the model.
Okay.
And what was complicated was that people didn't understand the connection of the activities. So
I see.
You get to the point where you say outreach workers, right? That Richard had. Ceasefire called them, street outreach workers / interrupters, right? When people see outreach workers, they didn't see the value in the work that they did. Now, Sluckin said that this work created a new category of healthcare worker, which is a street outreach worker. And not just anybody could be a street outreach worker. It had to be someone that understood the culture, came from the culture, and had the ability to attempt to do mediations within those communities, right? And when you do these mediations, and I'll talk about this, throughout our conversation, the first part of the model is interrupting the transmission of the disease, right? So with this new category of healthcare worker that Sluckin talks about, and at the time that Richard and Aaron Dalton were able to actually assemble, these were guys that had the ability to literally mediate conflicts. Now, when they mediated those conflicts, they were interrupting the transmission of a disease. Every successful mediation prevented that transition from happening, which allows another transmission to happen because that transmission happened. We look
So
at
you're
it.
stopping the sequence, you're stopping the pattern.
Well, you're stopping a pattern, but individuals, here's the thing about violence in our communities. Everybody that's in the community knows that if this guy and that guy kind of gets into it, there's going to be a bunch of stuff that'll happen from that that has nothing to do with just those two.
Like repercussions and consequences.
Right. If this happens and they get into a fight and then they may evolve guns, there's going to be so many other folks that'll get pulled into that. So we know that if we could stop this one thing from happening, it will prevent the other people from having to be involved in this particular matter. And in the 90s and in the early 2000s, it was like more guaranteed that if this one thing happened, there would be more things that'll happen after that because of just the way that the communities were kind of more clicked off more clicks off at that particular time. So as a resident, man, if I could just get these particular individuals not to get into this conflict, we can prevent something else from happening.
Got it.
So you see it, you might hear people speak about it, but when the language finally caught up to it, the public health approach, you say, okay, these guys are interrupting the transmission of a disease. You know what I mean? And it's just like when you think of any other disease, if a transmission of a disease happens, because that happened, it gives the ability for it to be transmitted to other people now. You know what I mean? Because now these individuals crossed each other, the disease has transmitted between them. Now people that he runs across, he can transmit the disease to. People that he runs across, he can transmit the disease to. Because they came across each other and the disease transmitted, it happened, in a sense. So it's always been the goal with treating the disease is the first thing is interrupting the transmission of the disease.
And that highlights the importance of outreach workers, helps people see the value in it, and I think also highlights the importance of trainings to equip those outreach workers, because to your point, it can't just be someone that just wants to walk in and start doing mediation.
Right. So you with the language and the way that the language eventually evolved is you seen that only certain people could play that role, but then you also ended up seeing the value of that particular person. You know what I mean? It took Sluckin years to eventually get to the point that people say, oh, that's the value of street outreach. You know what I mean? I mean, even, when I started out as a street outreach, worker, I always knew we gotta find a better way of communicating the value of what we do, because a lot of the stuff that was happening was behind closed doors. You know what I mean? Where there was guys, at one point, One Vision, One Life had over 50 outreach workers throughout the city of Pittsburgh. And these are guys, man, that had the influence in their communities to where they could say, they could squash beefs, literally mediate conflict, right? And it wasn't something that you could just go broadcast and be like, yo, they just mediated this or mediated that. But I knew the value, and I was like, we gotta find ways of showing value in what happened. And technically, what you end up saying is what didn't happen.
Right.
Because they are so valuable, something didn't happen.
Right.
And now you get caught up in this game of counting. How do you count something that didn't happen?
Exactly. Yeah. How do you explain the sequence of repercussions or consequences that were avoided because you interrupted the transmission?
Because you interrupted the transmission.
Okay. So that's Dr. Sluckin and Ceasefire. Are there any other national models that come to mind?
So Ceasefire so Sluckin realized that he had to kind of carve his niche of what he was doing, and he transitioned to cure violence.
Cure violence.
Right. So Ceasefire became Cure Violence.
Okay.
And then as you know right now, there's you got Cities United that are kind of like putting all these languages together, because Cure Violence, when it comes to street outreach work, they look to Cure Violence model.
I see.
You know what I mean? They have it in the model, and then you have Kennedy. You got the what GVI is currently doing, and that's focused deterrence. So that's focused deterrence and more custom notification, which is also, very important and beneficial, because what happened over the years is that as violence was taking place, you would get to the point of doing heavier saturation in the community that may have high exposure to the disease of violence, and then how you end up doing out of saturation ends up creating a rift between the community and law enforcement.
So that saturation is law enforcement.
Yeah, the heavy saturation, because
that's boots on the ground.
That's boots on the ground. You might want to kind of like you look up. There might be some cars being towed. There might just be some interaction that has to take place between law enforcement and community, because there's a high exposure of the disease of violence in these particular communities.
Right.
That was the old approach to policing, in a sense.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because former New York Mayor Mike Bloomberg, who's running for president currently, 2020, there was a recording that got released where he was kind of speaking to this philosophy. You look at where there's high concentrations of crime, and then you put many police officers there. That was the philosophy he was espousing. And then what he ended up saying in response to that was that there were all these unforeseen consequences of doing that.
Yes.
For him, particular, the like stop and frisk policy
Right.
and the negative impacts and outsized impact it had on Black and brown populations,
Right.
poor populations, et cetera. But it speaks to this philosophy of kind of addressing crime with boots on the ground.
Right.
And so what you're describing, as I understand it, is a transition away from that. These custom notifications and Dr. Kennedy's work is a way for law enforcement to play a role with outreach using this public health framing. Is that on the right track?
So it allow law enforcement to kind of transition to focused deterrent, where they want to kind of focus on who's responsible for what just happened.
Yeah.
You know, and let's have some interaction with the individuals responsible for what just happened. And the beauty of, to be honest, the beauty of Pittsburgh's model and where Pittsburgh is kind of at now is that they have focused deterrence, which is Kennedy's model, but they also have a level of the public health approach with the work that Cornell does.
Yeah.
So the work that Cornell does and the outreach that he has brings in that public health approach where
Right.
he has guys that can interrupt transmission, that can connect, that can prevent the future spread by connecting individuals to services, that can play the role of how you change community norms. So it ends up having, what the city has right now is a blend of two models. And that kind of like, let's say, evolved from the work that Cornell has been doing, and even with the mindset and the way that Chief Beckerstaff kind of like does the work that she does. And it has, and I've seen the work that she does where she's really she's really more concerned with interrupting the transmission before it kind of happened, to where old policing might have been, it happened, now we come in and we have to react off of the transmission happening already. So with Chief Beckerstaff and the work at Cornell, it was like, okay, and the whole team of folks that they kind of have is that let's get involved and prevent things from happening before law enforcement has to come in and after the transmission has taken place.
Got it. So this blended model, and even the leaders you've mentioned, Reverend Cornell Jones, Chief Bickerstaff, this is work happening at different levels and folks playing their role. So let's talk about the Office of Violence Prevention, which is a relatively recent entity coming from the health department, yes?
Right. So there was a year-long commission that Dr. Hacker, who was the director of the health department, sat on. It was a commission that Fitzgerald had put together to kind of have a group of 24 individuals take a look at violence and public health issues in areas throughout Allegheny County.
Around what year was this?
This might have been 2014.
So around 2014, you have County Executive Rich Fitzgerald
puts a commission
together.
Dr.
Karen Hacker is the current director of the health department.
Right.
The countywide health department,
right.
we should say, to study this.
Yeah, and so with this commission, the commission had the who's who in this different work. So I look, because I was looking at the members of the commission just yesterday. So you had Richard Garland on it, you had Rashard Birdsong, you had Cookie Coleman, the chief of police in Wilkinsburg, Chief Aaron Dalton may have been a member of that.
Yeah.
So it was individuals like from all over Allegheny County that they felt would be of value as it relates to looking at violence and mental health throughout Allegheny County.
Community leaders, subject matter experts, law enforcement.
Faith-based.
Faith-based leaders.
There was actually one of the co-chairs was a pastor or a reverend from the community, I believe, in Wilkinsburg. So and the thing was they didn't just meet once; they met for a whole year. And from this year of them meeting, Ed Gainey,
Representative Ed Gainey,
Representative Ed Gainey, Jake Wheatley,
yep,
all of these individuals, Representative Wayne Fontana.
Got it.
Was on this. So all of these individuals came together for a year long to say, here's the issues, here's what we need to address. And from that, they put together a 65-page report called the P&C report, on the commission's report. And it was on violence and public and mental health. And from that, within one of the recommendations in there was for the health department to take a public health approach to gun violence. You know what I mean? And from that, Dr. Hacker ended up getting a grant from Heinz Endowment to give me the opportunity to open up the office, taking this public health approach to gun violence.
So now you have this local and regional political engagement of different leaders, faith-based leaders, community outreach workers, subject matter experts, a series of recommendations, one of which is to take this, formalize and actualize this public health approach. And then you have involvement with local philanthropy, the Heinz Endowments, gives a grant to begin this work at the county health department. Okay, so you're brought on. You're leading this with Dr. Hacker and other leaders. How has this work evolved since then?
Two things with opening up the office. Well, there was three things in a sense. One was to put a commission, community advisory board together. Which you sat on, the community advisory board, and I appreciate your work with that. So we put a community advisory board together, and it ended up being like 32 individuals from sectors all throughout Allegheny County.
It was broad.
Yes, it really was. And then the second part was to issue two RFPs. One was for outreach, to do outreach work outside of city limits, and those outreach workers would do some of the things that are part of the Cure Violence model. And then there was also a trauma response. And at the time it was Focus Pittsburgh, who now is
the Neighborhood
Resilience Project. So we ended up having those three things ended up in place, and we did them. Out in the county, Richard Garland, the University of Pittsburgh, and his outreach team did the outreach component outside of city limits, and Focus Pittsburgh responded to homicides that would take place throughout Allegheny County. And as you know, the Community Advisory Board met. We met at one point, we met monthly, then we got to the point of meeting quarterly, and that work took place. And it kind of got us to where we're at now, to the point that, we ended up bringing in Ross Watson Jr. To be the manager of the office as we look to expand and provide more resources to the office. And he was able to write a grant that we ended up receiving from the PCCD to actually implement Cure Violence, the whole model, with the assistance of the individual from Chicago, and we're implementing that in Wilkinsburg. So this is, right next to the neighborhood of Homewood in the city of Pittsburgh, but is a separate municipality. Right. And the one thing that's unique, unfortunately, right now about Wilkinsburg is that out of the county, it had the most homicides. Outside of city limits, it had the most homicides in Allegheny County. So we're talking about an area that's like 2.1 miles, and it had 11 homicides last year.
So 2.1 like square miles?
Yes, 2.1 square miles, and it had 11. So it led the county in homicides last year. Wilkinsburg did.
So you mentioned how in Pittsburgh right now there's this blended model that's taking advantage of these evidence-based best practices and all the connectivity of the different levels of folks that do this work. And recently in the city of Pittsburgh, there's been a different story. There's been a reduction in homicides
in the city.
And better reporting between the levels to a certain extent, and also some framing about how this work is happening. How would you suggest that the county moves forward as well, given that there's all of these municipalities within it, 130 different.
So the one thing that kind of has to take place is that there has to be a continued investment in outreach work to take place outside of, in county areas. Like, so we ended up, after the 2-year contract was over with Richard and outreach team, we no longer have outreach outside, in the county areas outside of when we implement this Cure Violence model.
In Wilkinsburg.
And so it'll just be in Wilkinsburg. So right now, when we look at the work and the model, we won't have any interrupters. So we won't have anybody that would play the role of interrupting the transmission of the disease in these county areas. Right now we won't kind of have that outside of Wilkinsburg. And I think, it'll be evident with the work that'll take place in Wilkinsburg, the need for it in these other areas. And then there's also a challenge with these so many different municipalities, different law enforcement agencies in these different areas outside of city limits in the county, to kind of get them on the same page of maybe doing some focused deterrence work, similar to what, the city does, and then getting them all to buy in to finding value in individuals that could play role of outreach workers and the value that they can have in actually helping to improve the community and the, the quality of life in those communities.
Would you say that it's a positive indicator that, as opposed to having to rely on maybe some national models that have done well in other contexts, we have a track record here recently of both the city and the county taking some positive steps and looking at this deterrence work, looking at the role that law enforcement and outreach can play, et cetera?
Yeah, well, so a short answer or a quick answer to what you just asked is that right now in Allegheny County, we have everything that we need, to be honest. We just need to get to the point of just expanding the work. Because of the makeup in how Allegheny County is kind of right now, the borders don't exist like they kind of did in a sense. There used to, be, folks lived in the city, and folks lived in the county may have lived in the county. But now you can see folks that are out in county neighborhoods, and truly they're from the city. They feel like, I am from the city. They will not tell you that they live in these new areas that they're currently occupying. They'll identify with where they kind of came from. Where their roots are, where their families are, where they still may have family at. So, we actually have to take the approach on a county level. It has to be a coordination of efforts with city county efforts, and we've been attempting to do that with we have a great working relationship with GVI and Cornell and them, but there needs to be an official coordination of efforts to be able to say, okay, we're implementing the GVI model and the public health approach model to gun violence throughout Allegheny County.
Got it.
You know what I mean? Because at the same time that we've seen great success in the city of Pittsburgh, we also seen a great increase of homicides outside of city limits.
Okay. We have a couple minutes left here. I want to take a little bit of a pivot, though it's related, because part of the Cure Violence model, as I understand it, is this idea of changing community norms as well. Right. You do that through the lens of activities, connections to services, et cetera. We were just downstairs here in the City County building, and there's a great Negro Leagues display down there. It's been up for most of this month, and plays a great tribute to the extraordinary history of the Negro Leagues, but also to the Grays and the Crawfords here in Pittsburgh. You've been involved with baseball and youth baseball around the city for a while. What is it about baseball, the legacy of the Negro Leagues, that resonates with you, and how do you see the role of sports and those kind of structured activities in some of this changing community norms activity?
Well, when you understand the model, there's a piece in the model. One is changing community norms, but there's also an underlining piece in both models. If you ever hear Kennedy talk, you ever hear Sluckin talk, and if you ever seen the work that Vision One Life was doing of connecting youth with activities, connecting them with identities. When you connect them with activities, it gives them an identity, and that can actually create a level of safety in the community. So me, I always was, into basketball. So there was a period where I was kind of doing basketball camps when I was working with One Vision One Life. But I transitioned my work into baseball because I played Little League baseball growing up, and I just realized that how baseball had kind of died in our different communities. We used to have 2-3 baseball leagues on the north side. The Hill always had a great baseball league. And these were minority kids playing the game of baseball, when I was coming up. So I got to the point that, as my son was born, that I focused on him playing baseball and get as many minorities as I possibly could, the kids that look like him, into playing the game of baseball. And we were actually successful at doing that. I did it up at Brighton Heights. I currently coach the Pirates RBI program, which is, the goal is to actually revitalize baseball in the inner city. And nowadays, the inner city kind of shifts a little bit. It may be revitalizing, baseball in Swissville or McKeesport and whatnot. And baseball is a game to where, it's an identity that when kids really get involved and you really maximize their opportunities, it can create an identity that creates a level of safety, but actually can give them a return, in the future where kids, can play baseball on the next level. They can, go to Division I, Division II, Division III schools and play the game of baseball. And they just need individuals that are committed to teaching them the proper fundamentals. And when they do that, you'll have a level of success. 2-3 years ago, we actually won the Mayor's Cup. And if you look at the picture of the kids that are on my team, it was about an 85 to 90% minority team. And we won the Mayor's Cup, you know, and we've won, you know, a gang of championships, you know, within this realm of baseball on the local level. So once, you know, you get the kids involved and they see that you're putting time into them, you know, they'll also give you that same energy in return. And when they start to see success, because they're putting the time in, they get excited, they get engaged. And if you ever get a chance to see a Brighton Heights team come, you'll see that work that I kind of started doing 7-8 years ago, because you'll see a lot of minorities at Brighton Heights playing a game of baseball compared to if they come across some of the other teams, you know, you won't quite see those number of minorities. So to me, I'm really proud of the work that I've been doing, but I'm really proud at the way that some of the parents of the kids that I've taught, you know, the game of baseball over the years, you know, continue to bring them back and keep them engaged. And to me, we will see a return, and you'll even see a return in the community when you get to the point that community recognizes a kid as a baseball player. Like, yeah, that kid, oh, he's a baseball player. And other kids in the community will recognize and say, oh, it becomes a part of their identity.
Yes. And
when you have those identities, you give the kid ability to have a network of friends that they can work on their social skills with, you know, that they can kind of connect to, where they see I'm playing baseball, another kid looks similar to me is playing baseball as well, rather than them coming into a space and they're truly a minority in this space and they kind of feel, you know, kind of out of, you know, not out of place in a sense.
Yeah.
So, you know, I'm hoping that the work that, you know, the RBI program is doing and what the Pirates program is doing is that we can continue this effort of getting minority kids back into playing the game of baseball, and realizing if you look at the work downstairs, you know, with the Negro League, you'll see that we were very successful at it when we played the game. You know, those guys were great baseball players, not just in the Negro League. Those guys had talent that can transition into any baseball field.
Right.
You know what I mean? And when they were given the opportunity to join, you know, the MLB, it showed.
Yeah.
They became Hall of Famers. You know, the numbers showed, you know, I mean, they say Satchel might have played at 40-something when he eventually let him into the MLB. You know what I mean? And every guy that transitioned from the Negro League into playing to the MLB, you know, showed a lot of talent, you know, in their skill set.
Taili, thank you so much for your time,
hey, man. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate this, for real.
Yeah, we'll do another
really
one
do.
and talk more about baseball and the legacy there.
Because that's a whole segment we can do on just the baseball itself. Because I've been coaching it, man, for like the last 7 or 8 years now, and there's so many things I like to talk about as it relates to just baseball.
I hear you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again. Taili Thompson, Coordinator, Violence Prevention, the Office of Violence Prevention at the Allegheny County Health Department. That's all we have for you today. Thanks. See you next time.